Our next interview is with Ken Lopez, and Ken is a bookseller from the western part of Mass, and he's a specialist in modern literature, in Native American literature, and Vietnam literature. Am I missing anything, Ken?
No,
pretty much that. Could you just give us a little sort of thumbnail biographical sketch of where you started, education, family, what got you interested in books, and that kind of thing? Just
during the Vietnam War, I was of age to be drafted and didn't want to go to that war and left where I was and basically went underground for several years, for 5 or 6 years during the war till after the war was over. I was living out in the woods in California and up in Washington State. And when I came back above ground after essentially there was an amnesty declared for draft evaders, I went to school at a little place in Vermont called Goddard College. And one of the programs that I took there was a seminar in kind of community responsibility or something like that, and it was obviously something that resonated for a person who had evaded his country's armed services. And there was also a writing program I took part in there, and some of the people in that program, or at least a couple of them, had come back from Vietnam and were kind of like struggling with their own experiences and using writing as a way to explore them. And I got just interested in writing. I had a question for myself about my own decisions with regard to Vietnam, and I started reading books people had written about their own experiences, and I felt like I was one decision away from having gone to Vietnam and having been a vet and so forth, and, you know, what was their life like compared to mine? And the question I had was, you know, did I do the right thing for the right reason? Did I do the right thing but for the wrong reason? Did I do the wrong thing but for the right reason? Did I do the wrong thing for the wrong reason? And I still don't know the answer to that, but trying to answer that question was very interesting. It led me to a lot of books. It led me to writers who were struggling with trying to get down those questions and their answers. And at that point, I started looking for some books that I had heard of but couldn't find, and that led me into becoming essentially a book scout. And it was a book scout / book collector, because I was looking for them at first for myself, but what I found fairly quickly was that I was finding books other people had an interest in that I was aware of that I didn't want for myself, but I could sell them or trade them or something like that. So I kind of stumbled into becoming a book scout out of my own interest in the books I was looking for. And I worked in the bookstore at Goddard. You had to work when you went there. You had to take some job on campus, and so that was my first exposure to, you know, actually working in a bookstore and learning how to box books for shipping and things like that. And it happened during a time when Raymond Carver was teaching there and Richard Ford was a student there and so forth, so that there were these really good writers around who were, you know, not very well known at the time. And I started reading their stuff, and that just kind of brought me into the field of contemporary American literature, kind of, you know, by following my nose. And my first kind of author collection I put together was Raymond Carver, because he was there as a teacher. I thought, well, it'd be cool to get all his books. And at the time, it was a pretty doable thing. And I sold the collection a year or so later for $1,000, and I thought I was a genius, you know. And now, like, one of those books would be worth $5,000 or $6,000 all by itself, you know.
Time chance.
Yeah. But so that was where I got into both collecting and scouting. And then after that, I scouted for a while. I worked in retail new bookstores for several years. And
was this all in Massachusetts?
that was in Massachusetts. And then I had my first child, couldn't make a living as a bookstore clerk, and got a kind of real job in computers, and kept on kind of scouting as a sideline for several years, selling books to a handful of dealers that I had met. And at one point, I had enough books that they hadn't bought and I'd been doing it long enough that I knew a few names, that I did a catalog, you know. and it was my leftover unsold books, and my mailing list was like 13 names or something.
Wow.
The 13 people that I had met during those years, and sold enough of them that, you know, it seemed like, okay, I can do this. I did it as a kind of part-time thing for about 6 years.
When did you start doing this part-time?
In the late 70s. It was like 78, 77, 78.
And then 6 years later you...
Right, yeah. 6 years later, the day job I had was going to change sufficiently. I was working out of my house. I was telecommuting in the days before. That was not very common, and it was very congenial. But when it looked like I was going to have to go back to an office job for this company if I wanted to keep a job with them, I thought, well, I've been doing this book thing for a long time. Maybe I'll see if I can, you know, actually make a living at it. And so I tried. I decided, you know, that's what I would do. And I felt like in the first 6 weeks after I became a full-time bookseller that I learned more about the trade than I had learned in 6 years of doing it part-time.
Yeah.
That it was just an entirely different kettle of fish. And, you know, it wasn't just to support my collecting hobby and things like that. It was like to put food on the table for my, you know, my child, my wife, and me. And my wife had just stopped working, and she was going back to school at that point. So suddenly my nouveau bookseller income had to support it. Was the only income for our family. It was hairy, and it was a lot of work, and it worked well enough to be able to keep doing it.
What I can understand the Vietnam literature angle. Tell me about, and modern literature I can understand, but what about Native American literature? It seemed like there wasn't anybody even thinking of those terms when you started it.
It was pretty much the same kind of thing. In fact, the book that got me started as kind of a reader and collector of Vietnam literature was an anthology I bought at a new bookstore in Montpelier, Vermont, called Bear Pond Books. And it happened one day I was in there and saw a hardcover book on the new arrivals shelf that I'd never heard of by a person I'd never heard of, but it looked interesting. And I pulled it off the shelf and looked at it. It was called Ceremony by a woman named Leslie Marmon Silko, who was a part Indian, part white, part Mexican writer. And so it was $8.95, which is a lot of money for me at that point, but I bought it and read it. And it was so stunning to me what that book was that I thought, good Lord, you know, I've never read anything like this. And are there other Indian writers who have written things like this that I just didn't know about? So I started trying to find out, you know, what books had been written by Indian writers, American Indian writers. And there weren't that many of them. So it was like the Vietnam stuff. There was no real guide to the field at that point. It was kind of like, who wrote the blurbs on this book, and do they have any books, and try to find that kind of thing out. And I really did feel that there were things about American Indian writing as a genre or whatever that were different than just, you know, what we thought of as mainstream writing, and it was worth pursuing, you know, discovering it for myself. Once I was a bookseller, making it known to other people and so forth. So I kind of did that because I thought it deserved being done, and I didn't know anybody else who was doing it.
Obviously, your transition from pre-internet to post-internet was fairly simple, since you were a computer guy to begin with. Many of us were booksellers who had to use a computer. You were a computer guy who became a bookseller. So you must have had a real easy time of translating yourself into it.
You know, in certain ways, yes. And one of the things that the computer system that I worked on is this system where email was invented, and lots of other things that, you know, Usenet news groups and things like that were invented in this one system. It was a university system in the early 70s that grew out of a Defense Department system in the 60s. So in that sense, when I stopped working for them, one of the things I missed was, you know, the kind of discussions you would have in the forums and so forth that you see on the internet these days, and the kind of ease of personal communication that you have with email these days. Those were things I was actually used to by the early 80s and really liked. But in every other respect, you know, so the computer was a familiar object, a familiar tool in a certain sense, and I'd spent many thousands of hours in front of a screen by that time.
Yeah,
you know.
you
So
were
in that
well
sense,
inured to it.
I was totally comfortable with it. I didn't know HTML. I didn't know the programming languages for this, for the World Wide Web, And the first database that I remember was Interlock.
Sure.
And I was barely I didn't really like the approach. I didn't see how it was going to help me very much. It seemed kind of more expensive for the benefits it was going to be. So I kind of got on the computer database bandwagon more or less the same time other booksellers who didn't have computer backgrounds did. I mean, fairly early, but I wasn't way ahead of the curve or anything like that.
What system did you go with when you were searching for book software? Or did you develop your own?
We developed our own, but I didn't do it. I just hired
You had somebody
a
do
kid.
it for you.
One of my employees is, of the right generation to like to do this stuff, and
20-something.
Yeah, now he's 30-something. He was 20-something.
Yeah, but that's the age, right?
Yeah. And I had actually, I had done a lot of programming when I was working computers, and one of the things about it was that I felt like I was, reasonably competent, but I really didn't like it. It's like I could do it to make a living, but I like books.
Yeah, I'm not that crazy about it, but you got to have it.
Yeah, I mean, so if I didn't have to do the programming, that was fine with me. But that's also left me now, not at all up to speed on doing it myself. And if my employees who do these things for me were to leave, I'd have to, not quite start from scratch, but, I'd have a long learning curve to put my own website up and do all the maintenance on it and process the orders and those kinds of things.
The internet plays a part in everybody's business. What part does it play in yours? How many items do you have on? What percentage of your business is from the internet? What do you buy on the internet? I mean, tell me something about what you do with it as a tool.
Yeah. We've got about 15,000 books, maybe 20,000 online. That's most of our inventory, but not quite all of it. And the shortage is just because we haven't finished putting things online. It's not a kind of calculated decision. These days, I think we probably get maybe even as much as 60% of our orders from the internet.
Really?
Yeah. Now, I think that translates into about 30% of our money. And I'm not sure exactly that those numbers are right, but I think it's like that. We get, a handful of orders for cheap books every single day.
Yeah.
And some orders for moderately expensive or, expensive books from time to time. But I still think, most of our money comes out of catalog sales, and then some of it comes from book fairs like this. I buy on the internet somewhat. I haven't used it as much as I could. I haven't actively exploited Abe's, wants or something.
Yeah, me
the
neither.
way some people I know have, 1,000 wants listed so that anytime a book they're interested in comes on, they, have an early crack at it. I've used eBay some, but I hate it so much that it's really hard for me to bring myself to do it. But I do have an eBay scout, somebody who will go through the pain of, browsing eBay and trying to turn up,
Do you have any
things.
kind of sniping technology?
Yeah, use a
I suppose you have to if you're going to be bidding on stuff.
I think
on
so.
eBay.
I didn't for a while, and then finally decided,
You bit the bullet.
just like it's just easier. Just do it.
It is easier. When you said about 30% of your business was coming from the internet, and the most of your business is coming from catalogs, what part does the book fairs play in your career? What are the benefits to you and the detriments, if there are any?
Well, the benefits they're the tangible ones of seeing the actual human beings who buy the books and talking to them about things and so forth. And here at the fair, I haven't actually sold very much, and the things I have sold have been not very expensive. But I've enjoyed myself with a number of different people, just talking about things they saw in the booth or things they were interested in. And I think that carries over, from here. I always felt as though I couldn't predict my sales at book fairs, but that it was a little like showing the flag, that
Yeah.
you show up, you're there, people can see you, they can talk to you if they want to. The next time they receive your catalog, they're a little more comfortable with what it is they're dealing with. And lots of times I've had fairs where, I'll go home and have not sold anything to speak of, and the next week I'll sell a $10,000 book to somebody who looked at it at the fair. And not only do they buy that book, but they now know they can buy a $10,000 book from me in a catalog or anytime, or from the internet for that matter. And fairs always seem to me that's what their purpose for me is, because I've never sold, I've had such narrow fields of interest and focus that I've never sold all that much to the trade, because they're not that interested in the fields that I'm in.
No.
Or they think, well, in that particular tiny little niche, he knows more than I do, so I can't buy from him and raise the price, which is not usually true. But
Well, no, I know it isn't, but people do have that conception about a lot of dealers.
And the narrower your focus, the more likely.
The narrower is better. If you were going to go into the book business today, could you? Would you? How would you?
I think I could. I think I would. I think it would be, in some ways, as hard as it was when I went in, except that was so hard I can't imagine it would be that hard again.
It can't be any harder than that.
Right, but at the same time, you see all these people who are kind of novice booksellers on the different internet listservs and so forth, and they're going in, they're getting their feet wet, they're learning by their mistakes and so forth. I think one of the things I would do if I were smart enough or had a friend or mentor who was smart enough to encourage me is go out to the Colorado seminar. I mean, that has struck me as this incredibly rich resource that I don't think it was there when I was starting, or if it was, I just wasn't aware of it.
I don't think it was.
Yeah. But people do have a chance to do that, and the people who come out of it come out with this kind of, not only a body of knowledge, but a way to phrase questions intelligently and a network of people to whom they can ask these questions. And that just seems to me like, a new generation of serious booksellers is being kind of created every year by that seminar. So I think in that sense, I think all of us have a lot of very difficult things to deal with because of the net that we didn't have years ago when I started. But there are some resources right now that, nothing like them existed 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And you can kind of get a leg up on things with other people's help. I had Larry Dingman from Minnesota. When I worked in computers, I worked for Control Data, which had its headquarters out there. So I had to go out there at one point and spend 3 weeks. Larry became like a mentor to me. He'd been in the book business at that point for, whatever it had been for him, 15 years or something.
At least.
Yeah, and he was generous with his knowledge and information. And I'm still quoting him. I looked at a book of his one time and said, this is a good title. It's a rare book, and I'm just not quite sure what to think of it. And he said, book collecting is like real estate. Location, location, location. He said, condition. And he said it humorously, and I took it that way, but it was true, and I've repeated it lots of times. And walking around the fair today, there are plenty of bad copies of good books out there that I remember not to buy most of the time because this part of the market really, the condition is really what makes the rarity, and the rarity is what drives the price.
So expand a little bit on if a young bookseller were to come to you and say, Mr. Lopez, give me some advice about book selling in this era. What was some of the pieces of advice you might give that bookseller?
Well, I'm not sure. Actually, one did do that kind of systematically last year. He'd come down like every 3 weeks and take me out for coffee and pick my brain about whatever his questions were of the day or the week. I think the things I would say are surprisingly pretty much the same as they would have been 20 or 30 years ago, even though the environment is so different. And it would have to do with things like, follow your nose, because your own interest and your own passion, your own enthusiasm is going to be the most helpful thing you have
Driving
going for you. I was looking this morning at an archive that I'm trying to sell and realized I've given off a lot of my responsibilities for cataloging these archives to a cataloger. But when I'm looking at the archive, that's what's kindling my enthusiasm. And I may have actually been undermining my ability to sell these by having somebody else do some of the grunt work for me, because it separates me from that passion, you know.
Yeah.
And so I would tell people, you know, to stay with their passion, and if they think something matters, they're probably not going to be the only person who does, you know, and that's the foundation for a business that, you know, is more solid, I think, than trying to speculate about other people's interests and values and so forth, or follow somebody else's model.
How would you respond to the question, there are no young booksellers, there are no young collectors?
I don't think that's true at all.
Okay.
I think it looks like that in a fair like this, you know, and maybe even more so in New York, because all our books out here are really expensive. You have to be a very mature bookseller to have figured out how to stock those kinds of books. You have to be a very mature collector to have the disposable income. But, you know, when I remember my first purchase of a $30 book as a collector, that was a big deal for me. But it wasn't my first purchase as a collector. It was my first purchase as a collector of, you know, in that realm.
genre.
I think there are lots of people who are collecting now, and they're below our radar because they're buying $30 books or $15 books or occasionally a $100 book, and one or another of them might get on one of our radars. But I think the pool of collectors is young, is kind of fermenting and growing because books are so much more available. I mean, and it's not only that, they're so relatively cheap that the competition on the internet is driving prices of all sorts of books way, way down. They're making things that a $500 book 10 years ago is a $200 book today, and, you know, that's more affordable to a young collector than a $500 book would have been, or the $1,000 book it would have been if it had appreciated since then. So I just think that all these things are growing, but they're growing kind of at the kind of bottom end of the trade right now. So we're not seeing it at the more exalted, you know, higher price levels and the expensive book fairs and so forth. Those customers aren't yet here. And a lot of them will be in the next 10 years, I think.
So you have some rose-colored glasses with regard to the trade?
Something like that, yeah. I mean, I really do think it's been tough all along. But I think more people are buying more books of every sort now, and I've always thought that book collectors were a predictable percentage of the total book buyers. So if you've got, you know, book buying is growing, which that's, again, that may be an arguable thing. Yeah. But I do think there are a lot of collectors that are being kind of served by the internet right now, and will eventually be served only by this kind of market.
So you think that, in your opinion, we're not going to be a dead industry?
I don't think so. I don't, you know.
Well, I'd like to think not myself, but, you know, you have your worries and doubts.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely do, too. I'm not completely confident that I've got the right perspective on it, but I do think that, you know, they're out there, people buying books and people starting out selling books. A lot of the people starting selling books are retirees or second career people and so forth. But I think some of the people that I see from the Denver seminar are, you know, fairly young people and really sharp. I mean, you know, if I were doing things at their age that they're doing, I'd have owned the world by now, kind of thing, is how I think of it.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much for the interview.
You're
It was
very
excellent.
welcome. Thank you.
Ken, thank you very much.